I would agree to all those things. But the biggest distrust between both of our countries, both of our great nations, the United States and Russia, is coming from the fact that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, which took place in 1993, so it was a long process.
Before 1993,
okay.
1991.
Before 1993 and 1991, that's right after the first military coup attempt. But I want to stress the point that within more than 10 years after the first meeting between Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, and then later on when President Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, during the summits between Yeltsin and Bill Clinton, the United States had promised, and it did that many times, that it would not be expanding NATO alliance further up east. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened. So,
but do you think that one of the problems that Russia has about NATO is that it's not included in NATO?
That's the biggest problem.
Right,
it explains everything.
Okay.
It explains just everything, because NATO basically was formed to counterbalance Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact.
Okay.
The Soviets from spreading communism onto the rest of the world, especially onto the Western Europe.
And what happens if...
But with the breakup of the Soviet Union and with the elimination of communist system, there's no communism anymore in Russia. Basically, what's happened? So Russia
do you agree there's no communists anymore?
Well, there's no communist threat, but I want to say something. The Russians understand very well under Putin, and Putin still has a great deal of power, so do other former KGB people, is that just the threat of the Russians carrying out some sort of action against Ukraine, even Lithuania and Poland, can be very destabilizing. This gives Russia leverage. Now, under NATO, Poland and Lithuania enjoy a great deal of security and protection. If Russia became part of NATO, the organization would become ineffective as a defense organization against Russia. And that would be destabilizing to these countries. They still feel threatened.
I would not
agree.
Not only do they feel threatened, the Russians like the fact they feel threatened.
But what happens if Georgia becomes part of NATO, which was once part of Russia? What's going to happen then? Then I think Russia is going to be angrier. They're more angrier than it has ever been.
If we allow NATO to be neutralized, which offers protection now to Lithuania and Poland, the Poles will be very careful in their dealings with Georgia. If the Poles, for example, feel threatened by the Russians, they're not going to give any support to Georgia. As you know, the Russians are trying to topple the current government of Georgia. What gives the...
Let me explain. I actually haven't finished my sentence.
Okay, and then we'll
With the breakup of the Soviet Union, if you remember, and you should know that, Eastern Bloc ceased to exist. It was disbanded. So, however, NATO has expanded up to the eastern borders with Russia. So they incorporated Poland, Czech Republic, and even the former republics of the former Soviet Union, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. So it's within the close proximity to Russian capital. So the question is, what is the actual point of keeping NATO today? Is it something which should be viewed as a European defense system? Most Russians, they still believe, and this is the most important issue, that NATO is largely an anti-Russian bloc, military bloc, aimed at destroying Russia.
But that's paranoid. The destroying Russia part is paranoid.
I agree.
Yeah, but guys,
partially that's paranoid.
I'm not going to get in on this. Oh. But Russia has 30% of the world's gas reserves. It sits astride the transport grid by which energy flows from the entire post-Soviet zone to the rest of the world. I mean, we need to work with Russia.
Well,
they have 30% of its world's gas reserves.
Russia has fallen towards dictatorship from what we thought would be hopefully a healthy democracy. In order for those Baltic states that you mentioned to have healthy democracies, they need to be protected from a Russian threat, even an implied Russian threat. It's not necessarily a question, would Russia actually send troops back into Lithuania?
Michael, I agree with you. This is what I would call a mutual paranoia. Paranoia on the side of the Western nations who still believe that Russia is trying to restore its empire, Soviet empire, by trying to conquer the neighboring nations, which is insane.
What about the
Russia
Crimea?
does not have an intention to invade other countries. But in case, and you had some points when you mentioned Georgia and Ukraine, you have some points. Probably talking about the last August events of last year in Georgia. Yeah, there's been a lot of talks about Russia invading independent country of Georgia, but it was a pretty complicated issue because if you remember, Russia did not just invade Georgia for...
They prepared for months. They sent their tanks to be within position.
Yes, because according to the Russian intelligence, the Georgian president, Michael Saakashvili, who was actually, he got his education in America. He was a lawyer in New York for a couple of years. And for a number of years, his main advisor working in Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, just happened to be the key political advisor to John McCain during the last presidential campaign. This guy was actually on salary from the Georgian government for, I think, 5 years working in Tbilisi. So Michael Saakashvili, the current Georgian president, was viewed by many Russians as some kind of, American puppet of some sort. That's what they think. But Russia did invade Georgia briefly because they came to protect innocent Ossetians who were being killed by Georgian troops within like 5 hours. More than 2,000 people were killed.
But it's the same government that blew up apartment buildings in Moscow, that had a savage bombing of Chechnya. I don't think Russian government is particularly for human rights. They were quick to endorse the Ahmadinejad victory.
Again, this is not an easy issue because Chechen war is somewhat different. Chechen war is somewhat different. So we can talk about Chechen war. It's a very complicated...
Georgian forces were actually in Iraq. Michael, they were not threatening Russia.
I just want to ask, Michael, I want to add something.
They were threatening the neighboring republics which were part of
By the way,
Georgia.
I have a question for you. Why was Shevardnadze, why were the Russians trying to kill him when he was president of Georgia?
Russians tried to kill Shevardnadze?
He made that statement.
But
I'm not aware of that.
Michael, I think more important...
He was foreign minister under Gorbachev.
Michael, more important than that is we're talking about some past history, and I think this is really important, and I want to add this because we don't have that long of a show, and I think this is important. Since Russia possesses 95% of the world's nuclear arsenal, their cooperation is also crucial if the imperial nuclear nonproliferation regime is to be saved. And I think it's very important that Russia, we need to talk to Russia, and it's extremely what's going to happen since they are supplying some of their military operation to Iran right now. And I think this is, I mean, we could be talking about...
Well, let me correct something. 95% nuclear weapons, not Russia. I mean, Russia and the United States.
Right,
That's the wrong
but there is a gap between the United States and Russia that does concern me, which is that Russia has 10 times as many tactical battleground nuclear weapons, and those are sub-kiloton. And the reason it concerns me is these are weapons I believe that the Russians would actually use in a conventional battle with the U.S. Some people almost don't consider them nuclear weapons, but we would not retaliate using our strategic thermonuclear weapons because that would create Armageddon and apocalyptic nuclear exchange. So I think that the Russians have us on this, and Russian generals did say 10 years ago that because they cannot compete with U.S. military technology, they would have to use tactical nukes in a conventional battle. So I think that there is a very specific reason that they have tactical nukes, and 10 times as many as the U.S., if they believe that that's a card to play. Or
but they said they added something. They said when threatened by NATO, when the threat would be plausible. And talking about the U.S. anti-missile radar system, which the United States is planning to install in Poland and Czech Republic, that's another major issue with the Russians. Because they consider this system as basically an anti-Russian.
But you know very well the Russian military knows. No, it's not.
It's more anti-Iran,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
the
more
Russian military knows
I have to get in on this one.